So of course, whatever you use to grow an organism, you could use against them to control their growth, right? So this is the easiest topic for us, y'all. This is our everyday lives. We know about this, right? About what we need for growth and what we need to kill things, right? And we use this in our everyday lives, right? And you should be finishing up, if not finished already, by tomorrow, right? That discussion board on the cleaning agents, right? So make sure you take a look at that if you haven't yet and finish that up. Where you have to look at a chemical agent at home, right, that you use to clean, and write about it in the discussion board and look at 2 other people's posts. And remember to write their name as you reply to them. So when we grow bacteria in the lab, right, it really isn't all that different from growth of our own bodies, right? There are things that are needed, right? So we need to be able to build the major building blocks of a cell. And that's the one main reason why I don't consider a virus or any of those other infectious agents we just talked about as being living, because they are not organized to the cellular level, right? Some people would argue, oh, well, the envelope could be considered a membrane, right? But what else do you need inside of a cell to make proteins? What do you need inside of a cell to make proteins? Ribosomes. Do viruses come with ribosomes? No, they have to infect a cell and hijack the cell's ribosomes in order to make its own proteins. Outside of a cell, it's inert. It doesn't replicate. It can't do anything. All right. So although we say we kill them, we more than likely inactivate them. But the general population, right, if you told them you were inactivating viruses, they probably wouldn't feel as safe as you telling them you just killed it, right? Right? You just feel so much better when you say, oh, it's dead, it can't hurt me anymore, right? Well, it was never alive to begin with, as far as I'm concerned, right? But we can disrupt that envelope and stop it from attaching to us, right? That's one way we can disrupt the protein coat so they don't attach to us. But all cells, right, have proteins, which are made by ribosomes. They all have carbohydrates, which typically they use for what? What do we use carbohydrates for? Or what's another name for a carbohydrate? What do we use carbohydrates for? You think of sugars, right? Disaccharides, right? 2 sugars, right? Polysaccharides, many sugars, right? When you look at nutritional labels where they list sugars, they're usually a single sugar like glucose, or a disaccharide like sucrose, which is 2 sugars, glucose and fructose hooked together, right? Lactose is another one where it's 2 sugars hooked together. These are very simple sugars. Your body can very easily break them into 2 pieces, or take that single glucose in and digest it very quickly, right? So cells use these, right, as what, though? So we take glucose and what do? We break it down for energy, right? The most common use of carbohydrates, which are usually complex sugars, and their name tells you what they're made out of, right? Carbohydrates. They're carbon and water. That's what sugars are. Complex sugars is more than 1 sugar together. So on your nutritional labels, when they list sugars, they're talking about, you know, single sugars or disaccharide sugars, right? When they list carbohydrates, they're talking about more complex sugars like glycogen, which is how we hook a whole bunch of glucose together and store it in our cells, or starch. That's typically what plants do. Bacteria can do either. But we also learned about the cell wall of bacteria, right? And what was one of the components of it? Modified sugars, right? The N-acetyl glucosamine, right? The NAG and the NAM, right? The alternating sugars. Sugars can be structural, right? They can make up the capsule of bacteria. They can make up part of the cell wall of bacteria. They make up the cell wall of plants. Cellulose is just glucose hooked together. Right? The problem with that sugar is we don't have enzymes to break apart the glucoses. So we call cellulose fiber in our diet because it goes in one end and out the other. Right? We have no enzymes to digest it. So proteins we know are building blocks of the cells, right? They can also be functional as enzymes. Sugars are mainly energy, but they can be structural too. Nucleic acids, that's what? In the simplest term, it's DNA, it's RNA, it's what for the cell? Information, right? It's the storage and use of that information. Lipids, what's another name for a lipid? A fat, right? And we know these make up the what of the cell? The membranes, right? The phospholipids, right? Right? So these are the major components of the membrane. So you see how all of these major molecules are building blocks of the cell, right? They're all important for building a cell. But they themselves are made up of individual components, right? You should remember this from biology. What are proteins made out of? Amino acids. Carbohydrates, as I said, this is just sugars, right? More sugar attached to more sugar, right? Nucleic acids, we have DNA, we have RNA, are the two major ones, right? And then there's different types of RNAs. But this is an acronym, right? It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, right? Or ribonucleic acid. These are made out of building blocks. Anyone know what the building blocks are of nucleic acids? They're called nucleotides. What's the three major parts of a nucleotide? One of them is a sugar, right? Ribose is a sugar. The other is the nitrogenous base, which gives it its name, right? Whether we call it an adenine nucleotide or guanine or cytosine or thymine. And then how do we hook together them? It goes sugar to what, to sugar to what, sugar to what. It creates a backbone. Phosphates. Those are key. We talked about those before. Those are unique to nucleic acids, right? Lipids are the major building blocks of our cells. So now we're going to go down to the molecular level. So we're going to talk about the elements, right? So when I say an element, I'm talking about those letters on the periodic table, y'all. Remember those? Like C. What does C stand for on the periodic table? Carbon. N. O. Oxygen. H. Hydrogen. P. S. Sulfur. Those are your 6 right there. So when we look at these, right, that list of 6, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and oxygen. Did I forget that one? I always tend to forget that one. I don't know why. That one we used for more than just building cells, right? You need it for accepting electrons. These you need in very large amounts. Why? Because when we look at pictures in a moment of those molecules we just talked about, you find these, right? These are what make those molecules. Others are micronutrients. I just list a couple. I don't expect you guys to memorize the list, but I list a couple so you're familiar with them. Notice most of them are usually in their ionic form A lot of them are metals, right? So Na, anyone know what that is? Sodium, right? Mg, magnesium, that's a big one. Mn, manganese, right? And there are others, right, that play very important roles, but they can be recycled. They can be used more than once by the cell. So that's why we tend not to need them in such high quantities, right? That's why there are micronutrients. They're often required for protein structure and activity, right, when we're using them in an enzymatic way. Magnesium is a big one for your enzymes. So here's sugar. This first block, right, are sugars. So there's good old glucose, fructose, and galactose. For every molecule of carbon, you usually have a molecule of water. Hence the other name for these guys, carbohydrates. But you know them as sugars or saccharides, or when you put more than one sugar together as a polysaccharide. What you don't see in these is at these points would be a carbon atom. Here's one of the carbons here. But all of the molecules, if you look at all of them, so sugars, right, carbon is the backbone, and then you have hydrogen and oxygen attached to it, right? And as their name said, right, if you keep calling them carbohydrates, you'll always remember they're carbon and water. So that means carbon and H2O, right? We all know what water is, H2O. Everyone knows that nowadays. Whoever started that trend, I thank them. Right? Everyone knows the elements in water, right? H2O. Okay, so this block up here and these two blocks down here, there are 20 of these things, so they are amino acids. And they get their name by, again, notice carbons at their core. They've got hydrogen and oxygen, but they also have an amino group. In that amino group is a nitrogen. And then the other side of the molecule is always the carboxyl group. So they bind with each other, amino group to carboxyl group, and they line up, right, when the ribosome puts them together. And what sticks out of the main central carbon is what's referred to as the R group, or what changes. And this is my favorite one. I don't know, I like benzene rings. Probably because when I had to draw out these suckers, this was the easiest one to draw, right? Phenylalanine has got a benzene ring, right? But there are two very special amino acids, not to the nucleic acid yet, amino acids. This one, methionine, which is the start one for proteins in bacteria, right? And cysteine. So if you look closely, I think you can see it best on the methionine. What other letter do you see here other than carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen? Sulfur. So these two amino acids contain sulfur. And this is why proteins will contain sulfur. And this is why we can use sulfur, radioactive sulfur, to distinguish between proteins. And then we use a radioactive element in nucleic acids that's not found in proteins to distinguish nucleic acids from proteins. And that one is the phosphorus. So building blocks of nucleic acids, whether it's DNA or RNA, doesn't matter. They still have the phosphate group, they have the sugar, and they have the nitrogenous base. We know the nitrogenous bases vary by 1 for RNA, and the sugar varies by 1 oxygen, right? DNA is referred to by the fact that that ribose sugar is missing an oxygen it typically would have. And then you have phosphorus. So, that's a good way to compare and contrast these building blocks and what elements make them up. Make a table, right? So I even have these tables as a separate PowerPoint so you can print them out and practice writing in them. But we'll go through this one together. So for these, we're just going to say yes or no. So carbohydrates, do they contain carbon? Yes. And I number these so I know which way I'm going on my table. Because I forget sometimes. Okay. Do they contain oxygen? Yes. Hydrogen? Yes. Nitrogen? Nope. Phosphorus? Carbohydrates are just carbon and water, right? So no and no. Proteins, do they contain carbon? Yes. Oxygen? Yes. Nitrogen? Oh, wait a minute, I skipped ahead. Hydrogen? Yes. Nitrogen? Yes, right? That amino acid component contains the nitrogen. Phosphorus? No. Sulfur? Yeah, that's unique to proteins, right? 2 amino acids have it. Cysteine and methionine. You need to know those two. Okay, nucleic acids. Remember, they're made out of a sugar. So right there, do they have carbon? Hydrogen? Or oxygen, excuse me. And hydrogen, yes, right? That's the sugar component. Do they contain nitrogen? Yes. What do we call the A's, T's, G's, and C's, y'all? Nitrogenous bases. Oh, look, nitrogen's in the name. Do they contain phosphorus? Yes. Remember? Phosphate, sugar, phosphate, backbone. So you know this stuff. Just got to dissect it. Do they contain sulfur? No, because then that would ruin Hershey and Chase's experiment. Right? Okay. So do y'all see the pattern here? Do you think lipids contain carbon? Yeah. All our organic molecules contain carbon because, look, we can do carbon dating, right? Carbon dating is the decay rate of the carbon atom over time. Anything that was once living has carbon in it because all our major molecules, the core of them is carbon. The backbone, the middle of it, is all carbon. And then we stick what around it? What comes next? Oxygen and hydrogen. All our major molecules have carbon and water, basically. All of them. Where you get into the differences is the proteins have the nitrogen component, so do the nucleic acids. The difference between proteins and nucleic acids is proteins have got the sulfur, nucleic acids have got the phosphorus. You see that? Okay, so now we said, where are lipids in your cells? Membranes. What do we say membranes are made out of? What is that bilayer? Ah, phospholipid bilayer. Right? So some lipids contain phosphorus, definitely the ones that make up the membrane. They do not contain nitrogen. Some of them, yes, like phospholipids, right? And they do not contain sulfur. But you see when we put it in a table, you see the pattern, don't you? And a whole bunch of that information you knew already, right? We just had to put it together. Alright, so now we're going to put together a little bit more information. I think I have enough time for this one. Yeah, just enough. Okay, so when you look at this, you get lost, right? Okay, so, of course, scientists like to categorize organisms, right, based on what they can do. what I want you to focus in on at first for this objective is that we're going to talk about where organisms are getting their carbon, where they're getting their energy, and where they're getting their electrons, which also sometimes is hydrogen atoms. Like the whole hydrogen atom goes. Because in biological systems, right, a hydrogen atom is just an electron and a proton, right? Sometimes when that electron goes, the hydrogen atom follows along. The whole hydrogen atom goes, right? Electron and proton goes. But what really matters, right, for making energy, because you know about electron transport chain, right, is moving electrons. All right, so the first choice that we'll look at is, and when we classify these organisms, we're going to put all this together. So notice, right, we're going to put a whole bunch of prefixes together. So the first one deals with energy. So you're either an organism that has to get energy from chemicals, right, like us, right? You're going to eat sugar, you're going to break down sugar, you're going to get energy from it. Or you're an organism that can use light to put molecules together. You're a phototroph. Those are pretty easy, right? Chemo for chemicals, photo for photos, for light. The next is electrons. Remember, you got to have electrons to generate energy. But those electrons have to come from somewhere, right? For organic sources, you're referred to as an organotroph. If you're getting that electron from an inorganic molecule, like say sulfur, you're known as a lithotroph. Another name for that is a rock eater.
Where's that come from?
I don't know. But litho apparently means rock. Right? And so then, of course, right, we're just going down, right? So we're divided into two. And then the next choice is carbon source. If you're getting your carbon from an organic source, it's heterotrophic. If it's inorganic, it's said to be autotrophic. And this stems from the ability of these organisms to assimilate things on their own. So auto meaning self, right? So notice that we could end up with 8 different, if we put together all these possibilities, right? We could end up with 8 different categories. You see that? So, as I said, photo means light energy. Chemotrophs means it chemical energy. And it's where they're getting their electrons is going to determine what type of chemical energy, whether it's organic or inorganic, right? So you don't know unless you know where they're getting their electrons from. So those two are linked. Do you see that? To a certain extent, right? All right, so there's your rock eaters, right? Inorganic sources, right? So hydrogen gas or elemental sulfur, things like that. Organic molecules are things like glucose, like what we eat, would be an organotroph. Autotrophs assimilate carbon from inorganic sources, the most common being carbon dioxide, right? So right from the atmosphere. Heterotrophs have to have pre-existing carbon. It has to be in an organic form already. Some other organism has to put it together for heterotrophs. They can't do it on their own. Do you see the difference there? Hetero meaning different, auto meaning self, right? They themselves can take inorganic carbons and put it together. Heterotrophs are required to rely on others to put together organic carbon for them. All right, so there were 8 choices. Did I screw up my table? No. Now we're down to 5. Why 5? Because these are the only 5 that exist in nature currently. So, and I put them in order, right? energy source, right? Electron source, and then carbon source. So photo, litho, auto, right? Photo, organo, hetero, right? Puts it into each one of the classifications. We talk about energy, then electrons, and then carbon source when we use these terms. So here I kept that division, right? Photo, litho, auto, trophic. So photo tells us energy, right? So that energy is either light or chemical. Well, if it's photo, we know that means light. These are easy terms, right? Now, which way does my table go because I didn't number it? I think I go across, which would make sense, right? Let's hope. Okay, so then the electron source is litho, so that means it's inorganic, right? And the carbon source is auto, so is it carbon dioxide or organic? It's CO2, carbon dioxide. For the next nutritional type, an organism can be photo, we know means light. Organo means organic. We like that one, right? It's easy. Heterotrophic means, as far as carbon source, our choices are carbon dioxide or organic. Heterotroph means organic. Okay. So, look, just two choices for organisms that can use light energy. And do you notice that when the two things that are hooked together here is litho and auto. Inorganic sources of electrons and basically an inorganic source of carbon, or their other choice is organic source of electrons and carbon. Why is this? Especially for this choice, the organic source tends to be the same molecule. So when we go into chemotrophic organisms, notice again chemo-litho and organo-hetero. And then we have this one weird one who doesn't fit the typical rule that can use inorganic sources of electrons but uses organic sources of carbon. So let's quickly just go through our chart though. So chemo means chemical, right? Source of energy. But the next word let us know, because it's litho, that it was an inorganic source of electrons, and therefore inorganic chemicals are used for that energy. And it's autotrophic, so it's using what for carbon source? Carbon dioxide. Chemo-litho heterotroph, this guy is using inorganic energy, right, from inorganic molecules, using those electrons to use that chemical energy. But this organism can use an organic form of carbon. This will make sense when we look at the examples of organisms that can do these things. The last one, right, chemical energy that's organic, right? So chemo organotrophs, and their carbon source is also organic. This is us, y'all, right? Where do plants fall in this category? The top one. I'm out of time, aren't I? Been out of time. That's okay. Thank you for your patience.